Nia Calloway stumbled out of the high-end bakery's back exit, her worn sneakers slipping on the slick pavement as the heavy steel door slammed shut with a final, echoing thud. She had been shoved into the freezing rain barely 10 minutes earlier, framed for a theft she didn't commit by coworkers who viewed her honesty virtue as a threat to their own corruption. With no warning and no severance, Victor Harlow had stripped her of her livelihood and the tiny storage room where she slept, leaving her with nothing but a scuffed canvas bag that smelled of yeast and stale flour. The rain felt like a personal betrayal, a freezing downpour that soaked through her thin hoodie until the damp cotton clung to her shivering frame. Nia walked without direction, her shoulders hunched inward to trap what little warmth remained, her fingers white-knuckled around the strap of the bag that contained her entire life. 6 months. That was how long she had survived in that cramped storage room, sleeping on a thin pallet between flour sacks. 6 months of being the first one in and the last one out, keeping her head down and her integrity intact while Sabrina Cole and Derek Vaughn started cutting corners. She had thought her honesty was her shield. She was wrong. It had been her target. She didn't know that the broad-shouldered man watching from the black SUV idling at the corner owned the very floor she had just been forced to scrub. As the back window lowered slowly, Nia froze, facing a man with a sharp jawline and a focused, assessing gaze. When Kang Yimin rolled down his window and asked one simple question, "Why are you out here?" the trajectory of her life shifted instantly. The man who had just discarded her like trash would wake up the next morning to find his entire operation erased, unaware that the disposable girl he threw into the storm had just found her ultimate sanctuary. Nia Calloway did everything right. She worked the hardest shifts, slept on a concrete floor, and protected a business that wasn't even hers, all because of a virtue that her boss eventually used to destroy her. Now she's standing in the freezing rain with nothing but the clothes on her back, while the people who framed her are celebrating inside a warm building. I have to ask you honestly, if you saw a girl like Nia, soaked, shivering, and clearly broken, walking alone past your car tonight, would you actually roll down your window to help? Or would you look the other way and tell yourself it's not your problem? Drop a yes in the comments if you believe Nia deserves justice, and tell me, what is the one thing you would say to her in that SUV to make her feel safe again? Don't let her story end in the rain. Subscribe now if you are new here to see exactly how Kang Yimin dismantles the people who thought Nia was disposable. Don't forget to also drop the city and time you are watching from in the comment. Now let's get back to the story. The black luxury SUV's door closed with a solid, final thunk, instantly severing Nia from the violent roar of the storm outside. The transition was so abrupt it felt like a physical blow. The freezing, needle-like rain was replaced by a wave of immaculate, dry warmth that carried the scent of expensive cologne and a quiet, underlying presence of power. Nia sat huddled in the corner of the leather seat, her chaotic presence a jagged stain against the vehicle's pristine interior. She was soaked to the bone, her oversized gray jacket dripping onto the floor mats and her natural curly hair clinging to her neck in wet, matted strands. Her shoulders were hunched inward in a protective, self-contained posture, her fingers white-knuckled as she clutched the scuffed canvas bag that contained the meager remains of her life. Beside her, Kang Yimin sat in a state of slicked-back control that made the air in the car feel thin and pressurized. He didn't move to help her, nor did he offer a superficial comfort. He simply sat with one arm resting casually on the car door, his athletic, broad-shouldered frame draped in a tailored dark suit that cost more than Nia had made in her entire history of odd jobs. His face was angular and hardened, his neutral expression entirely unreadable as he watched her through eyes that didn't blink or soften. The contrast was absolute. Nia was the embodiment of emotional collapse and survival mode, while Yimin was the architect of authority and calm awareness. "Where are we going?" Nia asked, her voice barely a whisper, cracking under the weight of the exhaustion she had been carrying for 6 months. "You tell me," Yimin replied, his voice a low, quiet rasp that cut through the muffled drumming of the rain against the roof. Nia looked out the tinted window at the flickering streetlights of the slum road, the yellow pools of light reflecting on the cracked pavement. She realized with a hollow ache that she had no answer. She had no family to call, no friends close enough to show up at midnight, and the little money she'd saved in her bag wouldn't last more than a week in a hostel, if she was lucky. She turned to face him fully, the water still streaming down her face and mixing with the tears she no longer cared to hide. "I don't have anywhere to go," she admitted, the truth hanging in the air like a blade. She began to recount her life, her words tumbling out in a stream of desperate honesty. She told him about the 6 months she had spent surviving in the bakery's cramped storage room, sleeping on a thin pallet between flour sacks because it was the only door she could lock. She explained how that lock mattered, how it meant she was a cleaner, not merchandise, and that she could say no and still have a place to sleep. Yimin's expression didn't change as she spoke, but his dark eyes remained locked on her, assessing every tremor in her voice. She told him about the honesty virtue that had become her target, how she had kept her head down and refused to participate in the negotiations she saw happening in the back rooms, and how Sabrina Cole and Derek Vaughn had looked at her with growing discomfort every time she refused to look the other way. "They framed me," Nia said, her jaw tensing as she remembered Victor Harlow's face as he shoved her into the alley. "They committed a theft and told the manager it was me because they knew I wouldn't stop them next time. They knew my integrity was a threat to their business." She described her history before the bakery, the endless odd jobs she had worked since she was a child, moving from one slum road to another because she had no family to recall and no history to claim. She had been a ghost in the city, an unseen worker who was exactly what she looked like, a woman with nowhere left to go. Yimin leaned forward slightly, his elbows on his knees and his hands clasped, the visible ink along his hands catching the dim light of the cabin. He studied her soaked uniform and the way she gripped her bag as if it were the only thing keeping her tethered to the world. "You stayed in that room for months, listening to the corruption around you, and you still said no?" he asked, his voice flat but carrying a weight of attention that hadn't been there before. "I'm not that," Nia whispered, her eyes lowering to avoid his assessing gaze. "I'm just a cleaner. I did what I agreed to do, that's all." "You succeeded," Yimin corrected her, his gaze finally shifting toward the front of the car. He didn't offer her pity, he offered her a recognition that felt more like a vow. He pulled out his phone, his fingers moving across the screen with a swift, practiced efficiency that suggested he was already dismantling the world she had just left behind. The SUV pulled smoothly onto the main road, the engine's quiet idle the only sound in the cabin, as Nia realized she had made a choice. She had trusted a stranger with hard eyes and quiet threats, a man who sat in the shadows of the vehicle like a calm authority amid chaos. As the warmth of the car finally began to stop her shivering, Nia felt the emotional wall she had built to survive begin to crack. She was still a girl with nothing, but as she looked at the silent, powerful man beside her, she realized she was no longer walking in the rain alone. The black SUV glided through the rain-slicked streets of Seoul, its engine a low, predatory hum that seemed to vibrate through the very soles of Nia's worn sneakers. Inside the cabin, the silence was heavy, pressurized by the presence of the man beside her. Kang Yimin didn't look at her. He remained staring out the window, his focused, assessing gaze tracking the neon lights of the city as they blurred into streaks of blue and pink against the tinted glass. Nia sat as far into the corner as she could, her damp gray hoodie leaving a dark stain on the pristine leather, her natural curly hair still dripping slowly onto her shoulders. "You said you worked as a cleaner at the Golden Grain Bakery," Yimin said suddenly, his voice a low, melodic rasp that cut through the muffled drumming of the rain. It wasn't a question, but a statement of fact he had pulled from the fragments of her story. "Yes," Nia whispered, her voice barely audible. 6 months. I lived in the storage room because I had nowhere else to go. I just wanted to keep my head down and do my job." Yimin turned to face her then, his sharp jawline and defined cheekbones catching the dim light of the dashboard. There was a stillness to him that was more terrifying than the storm she had left behind, a calm authority that made her heart hammer against her ribs. He pulled out his phone, his fingers moving across the screen with a swift, practiced efficiency, and for a moment, the only sound was the faint tapping of glass. "Victor Harlow," Yimin said, the name sounding like a curse in his mouth. "The manager who threw you out. He told you that you were fired for theft." Nia nodded, her jaw tensing as the memory of the framing hit her like a fresh blow. Sabrina Cole and Derek Vaughn. They were the ones who actually took the money from the register. They knew I saw them. They knew my honesty virtue meant I wouldn't stay quiet for long, so they made sure I was gone before I could tell anyone. She looked down at her hands, her medium-dark skin pale under the stress. Victor didn't even listen. He just told me to pack my shit and shoved me into the rain. A cold, unreadable expression settled over Yimin's face, not surprise, but something much more dangerous. He leaned back against the seat, his athletic, broad-shouldered frame casting a shadow that seemed to swallow the light in the car. "They have been stealing from me," he said quietly, the words hanging in the air like a blade. Nia's breath caught. She looked at him, her eyes wide as the realization hit her. You own the bakery." "I own a lot of things," Yimin replied, his voice flat and devoid of warmth. "The golden grain is one of them, and it seems Victor Harlow has forgotten who he truly works for." The patient and terrible fury that Nia had sensed earlier began to radiate from him now, an ice-cold energy that filled the small space of the car. He made a call, speaking in rapid, clipped tones to someone on the other end, his orders sounding like a death sentence for the careers of the people who had wronged her. He didn't raise his voice, but the controlled danger in his tone was absolute. "We are going back," he said, ending the call and sliding the phone into his tailored suit jacket. "No, please," Nia stammered, panic rising in her chest. "I can't go back there, Victor. He'll call the police. He'll tell them I'm the thief." "He will do nothing," Yimin said, his gaze locked on hers with a protective intensity that made her shivering finally stop. "Not while you are with me. I want to meet the man who thinks he can use my property to exploit an honest girl and then throw her away like garbage." The SUV slowed as it turned onto the familiar street, the warm, golden glow of the bakery's storefront appearing through the downpour like a cruel joke. Nia saw the silhouettes of Sabrina and Derek through the glass, likely already celebrating their successful frame-up, unaware that the disposable girl they had discarded was returning with the king. Yimin opened his door, the rain darkening the shoulders of his expensive suit instantly, but he didn't seem to notice. He stood outside the car, waiting for her, his presence a vow of silk and ink against the night. Nia hesitated, her fingers fumbling with the strap of her scuffed canvas bag, her instinct screaming at her to run. "Stay close to me," Yimin commanded, his hand resting on the door frame as he leaned down to look at her. "Don't speak unless I tell you to. You are no longer a cleaner in that building, Nia. You are with me." Nia stepped out into the rain, her old sneakers squelching on the pavement just as they had when she was kicked out, but this time, the emotional wall of her shame was cracked. She followed him toward the entrance, her shoulders still hunched but her eyes fixed on the broad back of the man in the black suit. As they pushed through the doors, the bell chimed, a sound Nia had heard 1,000 times, but the atmosphere changed the moment Yimin crossed the threshold. The sharp edges of the staff's laughter died mid-sentence. Victor Harlow, who had been leaning against the counter with a smug smile, went white the second his eyes landed on the man standing beside the girl he had just evicted. Yimin didn't smile. He didn't greet them. He stood in the center of the room, surveying the bakery with the expression of a man inspecting a nest of thieves. His unreadable, focused gaze moved from Victor to the register, and then back to Nia, who stood in her soaked gray hoodie, a silent testament to the cruelty that had been enacted under his name. "Victor," Yimin said, his voice dropping into that terrifyingly quiet rasp. "Tell me why my best cleaner is standing in the rain while you are inside, counting money that doesn't belong to you." The wrath in the room was palpable, a systematic dismantling of Victor's confidence that was only just beginning. Nia watched, her heart pounding, as the man who had made her feel like a ghost now trembled under the shadow of the Mafia boss. The heavy glass door of the Golden Grain Bakery swung open with a chime that sounded like a funeral bell in the sudden, pressurized silence of the room. Nia followed closely behind Kang Yimin, her soaked sneakers leaving a trail of wet footprints on the polished floor she had spent 6 months keeping immaculate. Inside, the air was warm and smelled of cinnamon and expensive yeast, a sharp contrast to the bruised, heavy purple sky and the freezing rain that had nearly broken her spirit. Victor Harlow was standing near the high-end display cases, his hard, stern features twisted into a look of irritation that shifted instantly to raw, unfiltered panic as his eyes landed on Yimin. Beside him, Sabrina Cole and Derek Vaughn were leaning against the counter, their faces still wearing the remnants of the smirks they had used to watch Nia be shoved into the storm. They had been laughing, celebrating the negotiation that had finally removed the only girl with an honesty virtue from their sight. The moment Yimin stepped into the center of the room, the sharp edges of their confidence vanished. Sabrina's hand, which had been mid-gesture as she mocked Nia's hunched posture, froze in the air. Derek took a visible step back, his eyes darting toward the black SUV idling at the corner through the front window, realizing with a sickening jolt that the man who owned the building, the man who moved like smoke and dealt in precision that left no fingerprints, was standing right in front of them. Yimin didn't speak immediately. He stood with a calm authority that made the fluorescent lights of the bakery feel harsh and clinical. His focused, assessing gaze moved methodically from the cash register to the storage room door, and finally to the three people who had treated Nia like she was disposable. Nia stood just behind his shoulder, her natural curly hair clinging to her face in wet strands, her scuffed canvas bag clutched against her chest like a shield. She looked exactly like what they had made her, a woman with nowhere left to go, but now she was standing in the shadow of a king. "Mr. Harlow," Yimin said, his voice a low, melodic rasp that cut through the hum of the industrial refrigerators. "I recall giving orders that this location was to be run with the same slicked-back control as the rest of my holdings. Yet, I find my best cleaner in the rain and a nest of thieves behind my counter." Victor cleared his throat, his face turning a sickly shade of gray as he tried to pull his professional mask back into place. "Mr. Yimin, I can explain. Nia was caught stealing from the register. Sabrina and Derek witnessed it themselves. It was a matter of standard procedure for someone caught in the act." Sabrina nodded frantically, her glossy eyes darting between Yimin and the floor. "It's true, sir. She's been life-tired and desperate for weeks. She thought she could get away with it because she's a ghost here." Yimin's jaw tightened, a flash of patient and terrible fury moving across his features. He didn't look at Sabrina. He kept his eyes locked on Victor. "You believe that a girl who has spent 6 months sleeping on a thin pallet between flour sacks, rather than compromising her values, would suddenly decide to ruin herself over a few bills?" He stepped closer to the counter, his broad-shouldered frame casting a shadow that seemed to swallow Victor whole. "Or is it more likely that the people who found her integrity a target decided to erase her before she could report the skimming of deposits I'm already seeing in my digital audit?" The silence that followed was ice cold. Derek looked like he might be sick, his shoulders slumped as the planned backfire of their lies began to snap shut around them. They had expected Nia to disappear into the slum road and be forgotten. They hadn't expected the Mafia boss to roll down his window and ask a simple question. Yimin pulled out his phone, his fingers moving with practiced efficiency as he signaled for his tactical team to enter. "The midnight audit has already begun, Victor. My people are currently hacking into your offshore accounts and redirecting the funds you thought were hidden." He turned slightly to look at Nia, his expression shifting from neutral and unreadable to a flicker of focused concern. "Nia, show me the storage room." Nia led him toward the back, past the bathrooms and the storage bins she had scrubbed until her fingers ached. When they reached the door, Victor tried to protest, but one of Yimin's security guards moved to pin him against the wall with precision that left no room for escape. The storage room was barely bigger than a closet, and when Nia opened the door, it revealed exactly how she had been living. The mattress on the floor was gone, likely thrown into the alley along with the rest of her dignity. Just bare walls and a concrete floor remained. Yimin walked into the small space, his tailored dark suit looking wildly out of place against the cold concrete. He ran a hand along the wall where Nia had hung her single lamp, his unmistakably powerful presence filling the room. 6 months of this," he whispered, his voice holding a certainty that made Nia's breath catch. "And they still thought they could break you." He turned back to the hallway, his neutral expression replaced by a look of cold finality. Victor was now being led toward the front of the bakery by the guards. Sabrina and Derek were already being questioned in separate corners, their smirks long gone, replaced by the terrible silence of people who realized their lives had been erased from the map. "This location ends tonight," Yimin declared, his voice a low, melodic rasp that echoed off the tile walls. "I want a full audit of every transaction, every fabricated debt, and every illegal termination that happened under this roof." As Nia watched her former tormentors being dragged into the bruised, heavy purple night, she felt the emotional wall of her shame finally crumble. She was still wet and shivering, but she was no longer a disposable cleaner. She was the only person in the building who had passed the tests of virtue, and as she looked at Yimin, She knew the 3-year winter of her life was finally over. "You aren't going back to the street, Nia," Yi-min said, his hand resting on the door frame with quiet reverence. "The midnight audit isn't just about catching thieves. It's about finding the person who is extraordinary enough to deserve a throne." The clinical brightness of the Golden Grain Bakery's lighting felt like a spotlight on the wreckage of Nia's old life, as Kang Yi-min's audit team moved through the space with surgical efficiency. While the storm outside continued to hammer against the glass, turning the world into a bruised, heavy purple blur, the atmosphere inside had shifted from a scene of domestic injustice into a high-stakes forensic investigation. Yi-min stood near the marble counter, his tailored dark suit crisp and dry while Nia remained in her soaked hoodie, her natural curly hair slowly beginning to dry into chaotic coils as the warmth of the building finally started to penetrate her bones. Gabriella, the woman with short silver hair and sharp eyes who led the audit team, stepped forward, her heels clicking rhythmically against the floor Nia had spent 6 months keeping immaculate. She held a tablet out to Yi-min, the screen glowing with a series of spreadsheets and encrypted folders that had been pulled from Victor Harlow's private terminal within minutes of the building's lockdown. "We've bypassed the encryption on the manager's secondary ledger," Gabriella stated, her voice as professional and clinical as the equipment her team carried. The Golden Grain wasn't just losing money, it was being hollowed out from the inside. Victor Harlow has been running 2 sets of books for at least 5 months. Yi-min didn't look away from Victor, who was currently being held in a chair by 2 guards, his hard, stern features now a ruin of raw, unfiltered panic. "Explain the discrepancy," Yi-min commanded, his voice a low, melodic rasp that carried the weight of a death sentence for Victor's career. Gabriella gestured to the data on her screen. "There are over 147,000 rear in unreported cash transactions and another 200,000 in withheld wages and fabricated debt payments. But the most interesting part isn't the theft itself, it's the timing. Every major embezzlement spike over the last 3 weeks coincides with Nia Calloway's shifts." Nia felt her breath catch in her throat, her white-knuckled grip on her scuffed canvas bag tightening. She looked at Sabrina Cole and Derek Vaughn, who were standing in separate corners of the room, their smirks completely gone, replaced by a terrible silence. "They weren't just stealing," Nia whispered, the realization hitting her with the force of the freezing rain she had just escaped. "They were using my name. They were logging the missing cash under my employee ID." Gabriella nodded, her gaze shifting to Nia with a flicker of respect. "Exactly. Sabrina and Derek were the ones physically handling the registers, but they were using Nia's credentials to process refunds and voided transactions that never existed. They needed a fall guy, and because Nia refused to participate in their corrupt schemes or look the other way, she was the perfect target." Yi-min stepped closer to Victor, his broad-shouldered frame casting a long, intimidating shadow over the desk where the manager had once sat like a king. "You didn't throw her out because she stole," Yi-min said, his voice dropping into a tone of absolute certainty that made Victor flinch as if he had been struck. "You threw her out because her honesty was a threat. You knew that as long as she was in this building, you couldn't complete the dismantling of my profits without getting caught." Victor tried to speak, his mouth opening and closing like a landed fish, but no words came out. The evidence in the ledger was absolute. It documented every skimmed deposit and falsified invoice that Sabrina and Derek had executed under Victor's supervision. It even included a private chat log where Derek had complained to Sabrina that the cleaner is watching the cameras again, followed by Sabrina's chilling response. "Then we'll make sure she's the one the cameras catch." Nia felt a strange, hollowed-out sensation in her chest. For months, she had lived in the storage room, sleeping on a mattress between flour sacks and feeling like a ghost that nobody noticed. She had been told she was naive, that she didn't understand how the world worked, and that her honesty virtue was a luxury she couldn't afford. But now, as she watched Yi-min's people pull the truth from the shadows, she realized her integrity hadn't been a weakness. It had been the very thing that made her extraordinary enough for a Mafia boss to stop his car in the rain. "What about the theft from tonight?" Nia asked, her voice stronger now, no longer cracking with the shame of the accusation. Gabriella tapped a few more keys on her tablet, pulling up the security footage from 3 hours prior. On the screen, the high-definition cameras showed Sabrina Cole sliding a stack of bills into her waistband, while Derek Vaughn stood watch near the kitchen entrance. Minutes later, The footage showed Victor Harlow entering the frame, looking at the empty register, and then heading straight for the storage room where Nia was resting. He didn't even check the logs, Yimin noted, his focused, assessing gaze narrowing as he watched the screen. He already had the narrative written. He just needed the girl with no family and nowhere left to go to be the villain in his story. Yimin turned away from the monitors and looked at Nia. The emotional wall between them seemed to vibrate with the intensity of his presence. He didn't offer her a shallow apology. Instead, he offered her the final verdict. Victor, Sabrina, Derek, you are all terminated effective immediately, Yimin declared, his voice echoing through the silent, gutted bakery. But you aren't just losing your jobs. Gabriella has already contacted federal authorities regarding the fraud, embezzlement, and the coercion of staff members into illegal labor practices. You'll be lucky to see daylight in the next decade. As the guards began to lead the trio out toward the waiting black sedans in the rain, Victor turned back one last time, his face a mask of raw, unfiltered panic. But Yimin had already turned his back on them, his attention entirely focused on the girl who had walked away from everything rather than compromise who she was. Nia looked at the scuffed canvas bag at her feet, then up at the man who had become her ultimate shield. The truth in the ledger had set her free, but as Yimin handed her a business card with heavy paper and embossed lettering, she knew her journey from the storage room was only just beginning. You were right to say no, Nia, Yimin said, his hand resting on the marble counter with quiet reverence. The world tries to break people like you because it's afraid of what happens when you don't. Now, you're going to help me ensure it never happens in one of my buildings again. The heavy silence that followed the departure of the bakery's former staff was not the cold, abandoned, quiet Nia had feared when she was first shoved into the rain. It was a pressurized, expectant stillness. The truth in the ledger had been revealed, the nest of thieves had been purged, and now only Nia and Kang Yimin remained in the center of the golden grain. The clinical brightness of the bakery glinted off the marble counters she had polished until her fingers were raw, a silent testament to her 6 months of invisible labor. Yimin stood with his athletic, broad-shouldered frame reflected in the high-end display cases, his neutral expression giving away nothing of the patient and terrible fury that had just dismantled Victor Harlow's career. He looked at Nia, his focused, assessing gaze, taking in her soaked gray hoodie and the scuffed canvas bag that still sat on the floor, the only evidence of the life she had been living in a room barely bigger than a closet. They are gone, Yimin said, his voice a low, melodic rasp that vibrated through the warm air of the shop. The manager who threw you out, the coworkers who framed you, they will never step foot on my property again. Nia nodded, her natural curly hair heavy with the remnants of the storm. She felt a strange, hollowed-out sensation in her chest. For so long, her honesty virtue had been a target, a reason for people to look the other way or push her into the shadows. Now, the people who had treated her as disposable were being erased, but the weight of her own survival still pressed against her. Yimin reached into the pocket of his tailored dark suit and pulled out a heavy ring of brass keys. He didn't hand them to her immediately. Instead, he laid them on the very counter where Sabrina Cole had once slid bills with malicious intent. Victor Harlow claimed you weren't a good fit for this team because you wouldn't participate in his corruption, Yimin said, his eyes narrowing slightly. He was right. You don't fit among thieves, but a business like this requires a lock on the door that can't be picked by greed. He gestured to the empty bakery, the silence of which was now being filled by the rhythmic hum of the industrial ovens Nia had cleaned every night. I am not just giving you back pay, Nia. I am giving you the authority you were denied because of your integrity. From this moment, you are no longer the cleaner. You are the manager of the Golden Grain Bakery. Nia's breath caught, her shoulders hunched inward as she stared at the keys. The emotional wall she had built to protect herself from the sharp edges of her reality felt like it was finally crumbling. I don't know how to run a business, she whispered, her voice barely above a whisper. I'm just a girl who had nowhere safe to go. You know this building better than the man I just fired, Yimin countered, his voice holding a certainty that acted as Nia's ultimate shield. You've seen the negotiations in the back rooms. You've heard the rumors. You've lived in the very storage room they used to exploit their power. He stepped closer, his unmistakably powerful presence filling the space between them. You have the outstanding abilities that others try to bury under layers of shame. I have tested you tonight, Nia, and you have shown me that you walk upright even in the rain." Nia looked at her hands, the medium-dark skin chapped from the punishment of the winter air and the caustic cleaning supplies. She thought about the 6 months she had spent as a ghost, keeping her head down and doing her job while the world told her she was naive. She thought about Lucia and the young ones who had been trapped because nobody had the strength to say no. "If I take these," Nia said, her voice growing stronger, "it won't be like it was, the girls who work here. They won't have to sell themselves to keep a roof over their heads." "That is exactly why I am giving them to you," Yi Min replied, a flicker of focused concern crossing his angular, hardened features. "I am burning it all down and rebuilding correctly. I need someone who knows what it means to be life-tired and still choose to be true." Nia reached out, her fingers trembling as they brushed the cold metal of the keys. As she closed her hand around them, the weight of the brass felt like a vow of silk and ink. She was no longer the disposable girl in the soaked gray hoodie. She was the woman who had refused to break, and now she had the power to ensure the golden grain was a sanctuary rather than a prison. Yi Min watched her, his neutral expression finally softening into something that resembled respect. "Tomorrow, my audit team will return to help you finalize the staffing, but tonight, the building is yours. There is a clean apartment waiting for you nearby, no more thin pallets between flour sacks." Nia looked around the bakery, seeing it for the first time not as a place of exhaustion and aching, but as a kingdom she had been extraordinary enough to win. She looked at the man who had stopped his car in the rain for a stranger, and she realized that the 3-year winter of her life was truly ending. "Thank you, Mr. Yi Min," she said, her head tilted up for the first time, no longer avoiding eye contact. "Don't thank me, Nia," he replied, turning toward the black SUV idling at the corner. "Just lead. Show them what happens when the girl they threw in the rain finally comes inside." As Yi Min walked out into the pre-morning gray, Nia stood in the center of the golden grain, the keys gripped tight in her hand. The rain had finally stopped, and for the first time in as long as she could remember, she had a lock on the door that she actually owned. 8 months had passed since the night the rain tried to swallow Nia Calloway whole, and the city of Seoul now shimmered under the golden, late-afternoon sun of a blossoming spring. The girl who had once stood in a soaked gray hoodie, with natural curly hair, clinging to her neck in wet, chaotic strands was gone, replaced by a woman who moved through the glass and steel corridors of the Kang Corporation with the slicked-back control of a natural leader. Nia was no longer hunched or avoiding eye contact. She walked upright, her shoulders back, dressed in a tailored charcoal suit that mirrored the athletic, broad-shouldered authority of the man who had found her in the dark. The Golden Grain Bakery had been her first proving ground. In the months following the midnight audit, Nia had transformed the shop from a nest for thieves into the most profitable flagship in Yi Min's portfolio. She had done it not by fear, but by the very honesty virtue that Victor Harlow had once tried to weaponize against her. She had hired staff who were life-tired and out of options, giving them the same lock on the door and sense of dignity that Yi Min had gifted her. But unbeknownst to Nia, her success at the bakery was only the first stage of a much larger evaluation. Kang Yi Min was a man of precision that left no fingerprints, and he did not elevate people to his inner circle based on potential alone. Throughout her tenure as manager, he had subjected Nia to a series of secret tests of virtue. There were the unreported cash, discrepancies left intentionally in the register to see if she would skim for herself, the lucrative but unethical entertainment services, contracts offered by third-party vendors that she had rejected with blade-like finality, and the several anonymous opportunities to sell company secrets for more money than she had ever seen. Nia had passed every single one, her integrity remaining as unwavering as it had been when she was sleeping on a thin pallet between flour sacks. Now she stood outside the heavy mahogany doors of Yi Min's executive suite on the top floor, her scuffed canvas bag, long ago replaced by a sleek leather briefcase. The emotional wall she once used to hide her shame had been rebuilt into a barrier of professional excellence. When the doors opened, she found Yi Min standing by the floor-to-ceiling windows, looking out over the city he controlled. He was as dangerous and unmistakably powerful as the night they met, his sharp jawline silhouetted against the amber sky. "You wanted to see me, Mr. Kang?" Nia asked, her voice resonant and clear, no longer barely above a whisper. Yi Min turned slowly, his focused, assessing gaze lingering on her with a quiet reverence that few in the corporation ever witnessed. He didn't offer a seat. He simply gestured to a leather folder on his desk, the truth in the ledger of a different kind. "I have monitored the Golden Grain's transition under your leadership, Nia," he said, his voice a low, melodic rasp. "You didn't just clean the building, you cleaned the culture. You found the discrepancies my own regional managers missed, and you treated the staff like they were extraordinary, not disposable." He stepped closer, his presence filling the room with the same gravity that had stopped her heart in the rain. "But more importantly, you stayed true to the girl who walked in the rain. You were offered premium services in the form of bribes and shortcuts, and you chose the hard path every single time." Nia looked at him, a flicker of the old, glossy-eyed vulnerability surfacing for just a moment before she suppressed it. "I told you that night, I'm just a person who does what she agreed to do. My honesty isn't for sale, Mr. Kang. It never was." "I know," Yi Min replied, and for the first time, a small, genuine smile touched his angular, hardened features. "Which is why you are wasted at the bakery. I need a shield at the corporate level, someone who can spot the manager who thinks he runs my club before he can ever start skimming deposits again." He picked up the folder and handed it to her. Inside was a contract for the position of Director of Operations for his largest subsidiary. The salary, the compensation for emotional distress from her past, and the new apartment, deed included, were beyond anything Nia had ever imagined in her survival mode dreams. It was her director's ascension, a move that would take her from the slum roads of her past to the pinnacle of the Kang Empire. "This is a lot of power, Nia," Yi Min said, his dark eyes unblinking. "In my world, power is gunfire and broken glass disguised as business. People will try to break you. They will try to find a weakness in your virtue. They will think you are naive because you aren't cruel." Nia gripped the folder, the weight of the vow she was making feeling solid in her hands. She thought of Sabrina and Derek, and of Victor Harlow, who had seen her only as merchandise to be discarded. She thought of the young ones like Lucia who were still out there, waiting for someone to roll down their window. "Let them try," Nia said, her voice like steel. "I spent 20 years with nothing and I didn't break. I'm not afraid of the sharp edges anymore." Yi Min nodded, his controlled, unreadable expression finally settling into one of clinical pride. "Then welcome to the board, Director Calloway. You've earned the right to burn it all down and rebuild it in your image." As Nia walked out of the office, the escouch of her old sneakers was replaced by the confident click of her heels. She was the right-hand woman of a king, a refuser who had become a ruler. The 3-year winter was a memory, and as she looked at the city lights flicker on through the corporate glass, Nia knew she was no longer just surviving. She was finally, undeniably, in control of her own destiny. The golden late-afternoon sun had long since dipped below the horizon, leaving the Seoul skyline bathed in the bruised, heavy purple of a restless twilight. Nia Calloway sat in the back of her new company sedan, the interior a sanctuary of black leather, immaculate and dry. A stark contrast to the memory of the slum road she once walked. As the director of operations, she was no longer the girl with natural curly hair clinging to her face in the rain. She was a woman of slick-back professional control, her charcoal suit a vow of silk and ink that signaled her ascension. Yet, despite the new apartment and the director's ascension, Nia still carried the hypervigilance of a survivor, a focused, assessing gaze that watched the mirrors as the city lights blurred past. She didn't notice the dented, nondescript van that had been trailing her since she left the Kang Corporation headquarters. She was preoccupied with the truth in the ledger of a new acquisition, her mind focused on maintaining the honesty virtue that had become the cornerstone of her leadership. It wasn't until her driver, a young, professional man named Raphael, tightened his grip on the steering wheel that the emotional wall of her calm began to vibrate with a familiar dread. "Director, we have a problem," Raphael said, his voice dropping into a low, quiet rasp that cut through the soft hum of the climate control. Before Nia could respond, the van surged forward, its engine a low, predatory hum that roared into a mechanical scream as it slammed into the rear quarter panel of the sedan. The impact sent a bone-jarring shudder through the car, the sound of gunfire and broken glass echoing in Nia's mind as the side window spiderwebbed. Raphael fought the wheel, his precision leaving no fingerprints, as he kept the car from spinning out into the heavy traffic of the Han River Bridge. The van swerved again, forcing them toward the cracked pavement of a narrow industrial off-ramp. As they were shoved into the shadows of a warehouse district, Nia saw the driver of the pursuing vehicle. It was Victor Harlow. His hard, stern features were twisted into a mask of raw, unfiltered panic and petty cruelty, his eyes wide with the desperation of a man who had seen his entire operation erased and had nothing left but a shadow of a monster. He looked life-tired and weathered, a jagged contrast to the tailored dark suit of the world he had been cast out of. "He's going to kill us," Nia whispered, her shoulders hunched inward as she clutched her leather briefcase like a scuffed canvas bag, a reflexive return to her survival mode. But unbeknownst to Nia, Kang Yi-min was a man of unmistakably powerful foresight who didn't leave things to chance. He had secretly placed securities in her car and monitored her transition with a protective intensity that spanned every kilometer of her commute. At the moment of the first impact, a warning notification had flashed on Yi-min's end, and the Mafia boss had moved with a precision that left no room for escape. As Victor Harlow's van prepared for a final, lethal ram, the darkness of the industrial road was suddenly pierced by the harsh and clinical strobe of high-intensity LEDs. Two black luxury SUVs, sleek and massive, roared from the side streets like sharks through water. They didn't just intervene, they systematically dismantled Victor's path. The lead SUV, driven by Yi-min's elite tactical team, performed a high-speed pit maneuver on the van. The sound of screeching tires and grinding metal filled the air as Victor's vehicle was sent spinning toward a corrugated metal wall. It came to a halt in a cloud of steam and artificial fog from the ruptured radiator. Raphael slammed the sedan into park, and within seconds, the security guards had materialized from the SUVs, arms crossed and expressions carved from stone. They moved with a quiet reverence toward Nia's car, ensuring her safety while others moved to extract Victor from the wreckage. Then a third vehicle arrived. The door opened, and Kang Yi-min stepped out into the bruised, heavy purple night. He didn't look at the wreckage, he looked only at Nia. His sharp jawline was set, and his dark eyes held a patient and terrible fury that Nia had only ever seen once before, the night she was thrown into the rain. He walked to her car, his presence filling the room even in the open air. He opened the door and reached out a hand, his pulse steady and strong against her trembling fingers. "I told you the world would try to break you because it's afraid of your virtue," Yi-min said, his voice a low, melodic rasp that acted as her ultimate shield. Nia looked at Victor Harlow, who was being dragged from the van, crying and begging for a mercy he had never shown her. He looked disposable now, a ghost of the man who had once owned her world. "You're safe now," Yi-min whispered, his focused concern a vow of silk and ink. "I am taking you to my house. The 3-year winter is over, Nia. From tonight, you stay where the sharp edges can never touch you." Nia allowed him to lead her to his car, her honesty virtue still intact, but her emotional wall finally crumbling in the face of his protection. As they pulled away from the cracked pavement and the wreckage of her past, she realized that the roadside ambush hadn't been her end. It was the final test of virtue that had proven she belonged in the king's sanctuary. The black sedan swept through the iron gates of Kang Yi-min's private estate, the tires whispering against the rain-slicked driveway as they ascended toward a sanctuary of glass and stone that looked more like a gilded fortress than a home. Inside the car, Nia sat in a state of quiet shock, her fingers still tracing the spider-webbed glass of the window where Victor's van had struck her only an hour before. The bruised, heavy purple of the Soul Night pressed against the windows, but inside, the air was warm and smelled of cedar, the scent of Yi-min's world. Yi-min didn't speak until they were deep within the interior of the mansion, a space of white marble and soft, charcoal silks that felt entirely removed from the cracked pavement and the shadow of monsters Nia had spent her life navigating. He led her into a high-ceilinged study where a fire crackled in the hearth, its amber light dancing across his sharp jawline and defined cheekbones. For the first time since the roadside ambush, the controlled, unreadable mask he wore for the world seemed to slip, replaced by a focused concern that made the air in the room feel heavy and pressurized. "Sit," he commanded softly, gesturing to a leather armchair that felt like a cashmere shield against the trauma of the night. He poured a glass of water and handed it to her, his pulse steady and strong as his fingers briefly brushed hers. Nia took it, her shoulders hunched inward as she looked up at the man who had become her ultimate shield. "You should have let me handle Victor the night we went to the bakery," Yimin said, his voice dropping into that low, melodic rasp. "I let him walk away with a legal process because I wanted to honor the honesty you value so much. I didn't want to stain your new life with the gunfire and broken glass of mine." Nia looked at the fire, the emotional wall she had spent years building finally starting to crumble. "I don't regret it," she whispered. "I've spent my whole life being disposable, Mr. Kang. If I had let you hurt him then, I would have been just like him, using fear to get what I want. I had to stay true to myself, even if it meant I was at risk." Yimin went very still. He walked to the window, looking out at the city he ruled with a calm authority, his athletic, broad-shouldered silhouette cutting a dark figure against the glass. "That is exactly why I can't let you go," he said, turning back to face her. The neutral expression was gone, replaced by a terrifyingly soft reverence. "I have spent my entire life surrounded by people who would sell their souls for a seat at my table. I have met independent contractors who lie for a living and regional managers who look the other way for a price." He stepped into the circle of firelight, his gaze unblinking and focused. "But then I found a girl in a soaked gray hoodie standing in a soul-style downpour with nowhere safe to go. You had every reason to be bitter. You had every reason to be life-tired and give up on the values that had cost you your home. And yet, when I asked you what happened, you told the truth. You chose your honesty virtue over the easy lie, even when you were broken and out of options." Nia's breath caught. She had never heard him speak with such unmistakable power and raw vulnerability. "I have tested you, Nia," Yimin admitted, his voice a whisper that cut through the silence of the mansion. "I left unreported cash in your path. I sent anonymous bribes to your office. I waited for the moment your outstanding abilities would be corrupted by the status I gave you. But you didn't break. You passed every test because your soul is made of something the sharp edges of this city can't cut." He knelt before her, his hands resting on the arms of her chair, his focused, assessing gaze now filled with a protective intensity. "I didn't just promote you because you were a good manager. I promoted you because I wanted you by my side. I fell for the girl in the rain because she was the only person I've ever met who was more powerful than me, because she had the strength to be kind when the world was cruel." Nia's eyes were glossy as if on the verge of tears, her medium-dark skin glowing in the firelight. "You're a mafia boss, Yimin. You move like smoke and erase operations by morning. Why would you care about a girl who used to sleep between flour sacks?" "Because that girl is the only sanctuary I have ever found," he replied, his jaw tightening as he reached out to tuck a stray curl of her natural curly hair behind her ear. "You are the right-hand woman I never knew I needed. My world is full of precision that leaves no fingerprints. But you leave a mark on everything you touch. You make this nest for thieves feel like a home." For a long moment, the only sound was the crackle of the flames. Nia looked at the visible ink along his hands and the slicked-back perfection of his groomed hair, realizing that this Mafia boss had been her ultimate shield. From the very first moment, their eyes met in the storm. "I was so afraid to trust you," Nia whispered, her shoulders finally dropping as she leaned toward him. "I thought you were just another shadow of a monster, waiting to decide if I was worth the trouble." "You were never a disposable trouble, Nia," Yimin vowed, his dark eyes searching hers. "You were a vow of silk and ink I made to myself the second I saw you walk upright in the rain. I love you because you are the only thing in this world that is truly extraordinary." Nia finally reached out, her fingers tracing the sharp jawline she had once feared. The 3-year winter of her isolation was gone, replaced by the heart of the king. As Yimin pulled her into a protective, self-contained embrace, Nia knew she wasn't just a survivor anymore. She was the woman who had refused to break, and she had finally found the one man who was extraordinary enough to love her for it. The skyline of Seoul glowed like a sea of diamonds as Nia Calloway stepped out of the black sedan, the warm spring breeze catching the hem of her floor-length gown of midnight silk. 8 months ago, she had been a ghost in the city, a girl with natural curly hair soaked and matted by a freezing rain that felt like a personal punishment. Now, as she stood before the grand entrance of the International Trade Summit, she was the right-hand woman of Kang Yimin, moving with a slicked-back grace that commanded the attention of every dignitary in the plaza. Her posture was no longer hunched with the weight of survival. It was upright and intentional, her focused, assessing gaze sweeping over the crowd with the calm authority of a director who had earned her throne through unyielding values. Beside her, Kang Yimin stood like a gilded fortress, his broad-shouldered frame draped in a tuxedo that mirrored the controlled danger he had possessed the night he first rolled down his SUV window. He didn't lead her by the hand as if she were a fragile ornament. Instead, they walked side by side, their shoulders touching in a silent vow of silk and ink that signaled their mutual protection. The visible ink along his hands was hidden beneath his crisp white cuffs, but the edge he carried remained, a certainty that acted as Nia's ultimate shield. Inside the grand ballroom, the clinical brightness of the chandeliers glinted off the champagne glasses and the polished marble, a far cry from the flickering streetlights of the slum road where Nia had once wandered without direction. As they moved through the crowd, Nia felt the weight of the emotional wall she had once used to hide her shame. It had been dismantled and rebuilt into a shield, a barrier of professional excellence that allowed her to navigate this nest for thieves with her honesty virtue intact. She watched as powerful men who reminded her of Victor Harlow, approached Yimin with smirks and negotiations that didn't really mean what they said. They looked at Nia with focused, assessing eyes, trying to find a weakness in her background, unaware that she had already passed tests of virtue that would have broken most of the people in the room. "Director Calloway," a high-ranking official said, bowing slightly. "We've heard the Golden Grain's systematic dismantling of its old management has led to record-breaking growth. To what do you attribute such a clean operation?" Nia met his gaze without avoiding eye contact, her medium-dark skin radiant in the amber light. "It's simple," she replied, her voice a low, melodic rasp that carried the certainty of her journey. "We stopped viewing our staff as disposable and started valuing the outstanding abilities that others try to bury under layers of shame. We provided a lock on the door and discovered that honesty is the most lucrative model there is." Yimin remained silent beside her, but she felt his protective intensity like a physical heat. He didn't need to speak. Nia had become his voice in the legitimate channels of his empire, the right-hand woman who could clean the culture of a company while he managed the sharp edges of their world. As the evening progressed, Nia found herself standing on the balcony overlooking the city, the bruised, heavy purple sky of the evening finally giving way to a clear, peaceful dawn. Yimin stepped out to join her, his neutral expression finally softening into a terrifyingly soft reverence as they stood alone in the quiet, steady air. "You handled the board members like you were born to it," Yimin whispered, his pulse steady as his hand found hers. "They don't know what to do with a woman who can't be coerced or bought." "They're afraid of the truth in the ledger," Nia smiled, leaning her head against his shoulder. "They're afraid of what happens when the girl who survived the 3-year winter finally decides to burn it all down and rebuild correctly." Yimin turned to her, his angular, hardened features illuminated by the flickering city lights. "I watched you tonight, Nia. You were the only sanctuary in that room. You stayed true to yourself even when you had every reason to play their game." He reached out, his fingers tracing the natural curly hair that was now styled and elegant, a far cry from the wet strands of the storage room. "I fell for the girl in the rain because she was extraordinary, but I love the woman standing here because she is my ultimate shield. You protect the part of me that I thought was erased from the map years ago." Nia felt her eyes grow glossy as if on the verge of tears, but they were tears of vindictive joy, not shame. She thought of the scuffed canvas bag she had once clutched to her chest, and the thin pallet between flour sacks where she had dreamed of a life she could finally choose freely. She looked at the man who had stopped his car in the rain and realized that their happily ever after wasn't a fairy tale of ease. It was a fortress of mutual protection built on the unyielding values they had both fought to keep. "We're going to change things, aren't we?" Nia asked, her shoulders finally dropping in the safety of his embrace. "We already have," Yimin vowed, his dark eyes unblinking as he looked out at the city they would now rule together. "The rain has finally stopped, Nia. From tonight, the only thing we will dismantle is the world that tries to tell us we don't belong here." As the first light of the morning sun began to bleed into pale yellow at the edges of the horizon, Nia Calloway stood tall beside her king. She was no longer a ghost or a refuser. She was a survivor, a director, and a partner, walking upright into a future she had chosen for herself, a future where she would never have to walk in the rain alone again.